right, hello, and welcome everyone to the fourth annual US WIN Outreach webinar hosted by NEI. My name is Katie Saltzgiver. I'm with the US WIN Communications Committee, and today I will be moderating this discussion on environmental justice in the nuclear industry. So before I introduce our panel today, I just want to let everyone know what these outreach webinars are all about. The general idea is, regardless of the topic, we want you, the audience, members of the nuclear industry, to leave with actionable ideas that you can share with your colleagues, your family and friends, your representatives, the general public. So today, our panelists will not only discuss the nuclear industry's environmental justice initiatives, but also how we all can help make those initiatives a reality. Okay, so as I mentioned, today's webinar is a panel discussion. I will be asking the panelists questions, but we want to leave some time at the end to answer audience questions as well. So if you have a question for the panel, please submit it through the QA function on Zoom. The chat function can be used to share information amongst yourselves, but please only use the Q&A function for asking questions for the panelists. All right, so now I'm really excited to introduce today's panel. First up, we have Sam Brinton. Sam serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Spent Fuel and Waste Disposition at the DOE. Among several others, one priority for Sam's office includes developing a consent-based siting process for consolidated federal interim storage of spent nuclear fuel. Our next panelist is Kara Colton. Kara is the Director of Nuclear Policy at the Energy Communities Alliance and has spent 15 years working with the local elected officials in frontline communities, hosting and directly impacted by the DOE's federal nuclear facilities. We also have Aditi Verma, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences at the University of Michigan, and is interested in how nuclear technologies can be designed in more just, equitable, and participatory ways. She was previously a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center's project on managing the atom and the International Security Program. And finally, we have Hillary Jacobs, who is an associate at the environmental law firm Beveridge and Diamond, where she advises clients on how to integrate environmental justice considerations into their operations, and serves as the deputy of the Environmental Justice Practice Group. All right, so with that, I'd like to get started with our questions, and I'll start this one off with Hillary, but everyone else can fill in as well. So just a bit of a background. Could you summarize a bit of the history of the environmental justice movement and why it is so imperative that we center environmental justice in our decision-making within the nuclear industry?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and that's a great question to get us started. The environmental justice movement originated in the civil rights era a few generations ago. There wasn't anything known as environmental justice, it was just called civil rights. And this movement really stems from the recognition that often environmentally impacting land uses that are just like result from our society functioning and existing end up disproportionately clustered around low income and minority communities that historically have been excluded from land use and environmental permitting processes and decisions. I'll give two quick examples of events that we often point to as early events in the history of the movement. One was in 1968 when 1,300 African-American men from the Memphis Department of Public Works went on strike to protest neglect and abuse of its employees after two garbage collectors were killed due to a malfunctioning truck. And this ended up, it was a huge protest, it gained national attention. And I really like to point this out because it shows the intersection of environmental justice and civil rights. These protests were the reason why Dr. Martin Luther King came to Memphis, where he was ultimately assassinated. So I just like to show that that relationship. Skip a few years later, in 1982, a predominantly African-American community in North Carolina was slated for being home to a landfill designed to contain PCB-laden soil, and the PCB soil had been dumped illegally on roads around the county. This also led to significant protests that garnered national attention and led to the creation of a couple of reports that really established for the first time the connection between race and waste facility locations, which was some of the first like empirical evidence that has since, we have much more of today, but it was pretty historic. So that's just a little bit of background, and bringing it back to where we are now with nuclear. I mean, I think historically the quick proliferation of a new energy resource has not been the best thing for all communities. But I think the renewable energy industry, in particular, the nuclear industry when it comes to small advanced nuclear reactors, has this really incredible opportunity to help transform our energy economy, but also to do things correctly from the start and learn from lessons that other energy industries and make corrections where those industries potentially failed. I think because the nuclear industry comes with a little bit of baggage, I think, which is a little bit different than, like, say, the offshore wind industry. I was just at a conference in which I spoke about this to them. And it's like completely new in the US, right? So, but nuclear energy has some history here. So I think it makes it all the more important for the industry to go above and beyond in engaging communities and centering our siting decisions around communities, because we really have this awesome opportunity to maximize this resource that can, really benefit, I think, the world. That's my 2 cents, and I'm going to get off my soapbox now and let someone else step in.
Would anyone else like to follow up on this question?
I'll add one small piece, which is there's a variety of different forms of environmental justice when it comes to nuclear, and that is basically the siting, the operation, the management after operation. But like these are 3 distinct areas where environmental justice all can kind of come in, and I feel that each actually has a very active role for environmental justice. I think we only generally tend to think of the stop something or like pre-operation moment, which, to be very clear, as Hillary already mentioned, is a long history. So there's the facility siting credo written at MIT decades ago that really set the stage for how industry could interact with environmental justice in a positive rather than antagonistic way. In terms of nuclear, of course, there's obviously a variety of conversations around environmental justice as to keeping nuclear power plants currently operating, right? Like there are environmental justice advocates now who use the operations of nuclear power as their, one of their tools in their toolbox, right? And last but not least, when it comes to waste, which we'll obviously get to in later parts, right? Environmental justice has to hold accountable those of us who are responsible for these types of decisions. So that way we're making sure that despite operations, despite siting, we must manage long-term. And that is something where I believe nuclear will be able to teach other energy sources about waste form. As Hillary just mentioned, I love the offshore wind comment. It's not just about the siting of offshore wind. It's about the waste products of wind and solar and all these other spaces that are going to have waste. But because nuclear has had so much attention on it, I believe we could actually be leaders in environmental justice when it comes to other spaces, which would be a nice change of pace. I wouldn't hate that kind of reputation. So just wanted to add on to Hillary's great opener there.
And actually, I just wanted to also get in on this. Hi, Sam and Hillary, and thank you all for inviting me here. Katie, appreciate being part of this conversation. So I think that the Energy Communities Alliance actually is an interesting character in this discussion, because we are the communities that have been the sites for federal facilities from as early as the Manhattan Project. We didn't really have a choice in where these facilities went, but here we are. And I think if anything, in the resiliency of communities is evident by the communities that we get to work with. These communities have come so far to recognize the opportunities that new nuclear can provide for them, but at the same time, they certainly understand, has cleanup been done? Where are the challenges related to cleanup? And the important role of these communities in helping to define what environmental justice is for them. And so just one point I want to make is we have a lot of overarching organizations right now that are looking at environmental justice and how do we ensure that it's addressed and how is it defined in this community versus another. The role of the community in helping to define environmental justice and also how to mitigate it is paramount. And so I just want to make sure that in these discussions, we all remember that it's important to have kind of an outline of a shared definition, if you will, but also allowing for the individual nature of the communities that might be interested in hosting new nuclear or are currently dealing with operating facility or waste.
If I could just add one more point based on what Sam shared, and I like how Sam, I was kind of speaking of environmental justice in a very simplistic fashion, thinking just about citing, but you're completely right. And I now wish I could go back and revise to talk about how it's so much more than just citing, it's operations, it's everything, it's decommissioning, it's all of that stuff. But one thing that I think we're going to touch on a little bit later, and I want to just lay the foundation for, is another strand of environmental justice has been recognizing that a lot of the same communities we're talking about have historically been underinvested, like chronically underinvested. And so the reaction to that right now, for the first time ever on the federal scale, has been to intentionally target benefits of the good things that we do in our society. So to these communities, to ensure that benefits are being equitably distributed. And that's something called the Justice 40 initiative, which is targeting 40% of certain federal investments to these communities, and that those types of investments include clean energy investments. So I just want to mention that because that's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about environmental justice. And I really like how Sam and Kara kind of scoped it out.
I would maybe add one other thing, and I know maybe this is a little bit simplistic, but I like to think of the different aspects of justice. So there's the procedural element, do communities have access to the decision-making processes that impact them? There's the distributional element, who is allocated the benefits and the burdens. There's also the acknowledgement aspect of it. We have to acknowledge the past harms, but then in some cases also the disproportionate benefits that might have accrued to certain communities. And then I think there's also the reparative element, which is very important. What policies, what actions, what measures can we undertake to repair those past harms? And I think this is where I really like what Kara said, like, what do each of those things mean to different communities? That's really what we have to understand. And maybe there are other axes that are not captured in that sort of, the sort of list of four types of justices, but nevertheless, I think I find it a helpful organizing framework to think about it. And then I think one other thing that I would add is that communities are not homogeneous. They are made up of many different kinds of people from different backgrounds. And so I think when we have these conversations about environmental justice, I think the thing that we're striving for really is consent and not consensus. And maybe also recognizing that what that looks like will change over time because communities change over time. So yes, that's the little bit that I wanted to add.
Those are all excellent points and they all tie into our discussion later. And so I'm really excited that you guys just set the groundwork for everything else. And it's a good segue into our second question. So this one I'll direct to Aditi, but once again, if anyone wants to fill in, they're welcome to. So there's this phenomenon within the industry of believing that nuclear energy is inherently good, unflawed, and that it's necessary to hold these views to ensure nuclear's future. But there are legacy issues within the nuclear industry that need to be addressed. And if we want the industry to be better, we need to recognize and acknowledge its missteps and view its history through a critical, reflective lens. So how do we address those legacy issues while also moving forward to build trust and treat communities as partners? In what way does the industry need to change, and how can we influence that?
That's such a big and important question, and I'll try to answer it, and I would love to hear what everybody else has to say as well. So I think the first thing to recognize is that technologies are not inherently good or neutral. They're actually, they embed the values and the normative decisions of the people who design them and who implement them. So I think it's important to recognize that the technologies are not, they're not inherently good, they're not even inherently bad or evil. But at the same time, they're sort of laden with the values that we infuse them with. Now, the nuclear industry specifically, I think one sort of misstep that we've made time and time again is how we viewed ourselves and our technologies in relation to the publics. And I say publics is plural deliberately because the public is not a monolithic whole. I think our engagement with the publics and with communities have been premised on a couple of things. The first is this deficit model that if the publics could just understand why these technologies were good, they would accept them, they would agree to cite them, they would agree to live with them. And I think that premise is inherently flawed, and unfortunately was sort of backed up by a lot of scholarship in the 60s and 70s in the risk perception field, where that scholarship found that in order to be able to build and implement risky technologies, engineers would either have to make those technologies significantly safer or try to explain their benefits to the publics. And the nuclear industry, for better or worse, I think worse, latched on to the second bit of advice there. And we sort of made it our mission to educate the public, assuming that there was this deficit of knowledge or information, if you will. And we disregarded, I think, the forms of knowledge and expertise that communities hold, that are forms of expertise that are valid and that should inform decision-making about what technologies are built, how they're built, where they're cited. I mean, as Kara was saying, the ECA communities were not consulted, for example, where, about the siting of those initial facilities. And so I think that is, I think, changing now in the industry, and that we're realizing that this cannot and should not be a one-way monologue from the nuclear sector to communities. This really needs to be, yes, there is curiosity in these communities. They want to know more about the new technologies and where the nuclear sector is headed. So there is curiosity. And I think our mission should be to inform and engage, not just this monologue of educate, and get acceptance. So I think there is a certain amount of humility, I think, that is necessary on our part as nuclear engineers, and also the recognition that these communities that we're hoping and seeking to serve through our work, they know what they want, they know what their energy needs are, they know they have visions for what their future should look like, and we need to be engaging these communities in the decision-making processes about how these technologies are developed, how they're implemented, how they're cited from as early on as possible, because I think we have this special moment now where communities across the country really, and across the world, I think, are taking an interest in nuclear energy technologies. They see nuclear energy technologies as a legitimate energy option. And I think that, I think we should use this moment as an opportunity to enter into conversations with these communities and sort of depart from what has traditionally been our monologuing approach. And with that, I'll stop my own monologue and let Sam and Kara and Hillary add to this, because I'm sure they have things to say as well.
Yeah, actually, I'll take off on Aditi's use of the word vision. I think sometimes, and I think the environmental management program at the Department of Energy is one of the first EJ initiatives that was undertaken, that's being undertaken. And in fact, ECA is actually a grant through the Department of Energy. We are part of it, EJ40 initiative, which is an exciting kind of designation to get. But you know, one thing, as I was saying, that I think is interesting is often in these conversations, it sounds like everybody thinks they're going to have to convince a community to take on a nuclear project. But I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that there are communities out there, like Aditi just referred to, that are already interested in learning more. And they have visions, whether it's carbon mitigation, whether it's a diversity of economic opportunity and energy supply. There are a million different reasons that a million different communities might be interested in hosting something nuclear. And I think that the way that industry should be speaking with the communities is, what is it that your goals are? And those goals for any community aren't short term. A mayor, for example, who's elected is not just trying to make sure that they've got this start and stop period where they haven't created a groundwork or a foundation for development and benefit to keep coming to those communities. So they have visions. What I think they need to understand is, what will this project require? What does it need in terms of access to water or transmission or infrastructure or workforce? And those kinds of elements really help move the ball forward. And then just another thing in terms of talking to these communities is, who's your messenger? Who is the trusted messenger here? So if you bring in a big IOU, I'm not sure that you're necessarily going to get the reaction or the kind of thinking going on that you would have if it were, let's say, now I just sound like I'm being biased, but a mayor of Zion in Illinois, for example. I'm not going to use my own. I wasn't biased. I went to Zion instead. But you know, that mayor will tell you, like, this is the challenge. These are the challenges we had. There was no back end answer here. So now we've got, reuse what we'd like to do, but we can't. Those kinds of conversations and having a peer-to-peer, if you will, opportunity, I think that creates more legs for moving forward on these kinds of issues.
Gosh, brilliancy. I will say this to the webinar participants, like, may you always be blessed with such brilliant women as are on this panel. I'm so lucky to be with all of you. Okay,
That's
so
in the mail, Sam.
there we are. There we go. The space is okay. So I want two major points that were said. So I want to first respond to Aditi and then respond to Kara. So when Aditi talks about distributive justice and procedural justice, it's important that we kind of have some of those frames for the acknowledgement, because that's what social science is telling us. We have had enough. I love me, Aditi and I actually shared offices, right? I'm at MIT, so I love my nerds. Like, I love my nerds forever. However, we could have learned more social science and it probably would have helped us. And social science gives those kinds of lenses. And the Department of Energy, under my tenure, is now writing reports with social science lenses. You'll see the words distributive justice and procedural justice for the first time in our RFI summary common analysis. And we're going to get to consent-based siting in the future, so I won't go into that detail, but I want to point out that that's what has to start happening in most of our reports. We cannot just have it be like a one-off report that we write on a process. It has to start to be integrated into each and every report. I will be honest to those of you who are like, but I need to have a reason to be able to read it. People will read it more. We have had way more reading of our RFI comment summary analysis, because it isn't just a what we heard report. It's a what we heard through the lens of social science and environmental justice, which makes environmental justice accessible. I need to be very clear. EJ is a really, really important aspect of work that sometimes gets painted with a brush that's not fair, and thus people will not try to access it. But if you talk about distribution, if you talk about procedure, sometimes those are ways that we can actually access environmental justice in a little bit nerdy of a way, right? Which will help the nuclear folks get along. And then to respond to Kara's point, really, really good about that you can't just show up and say that all things are hunky-dory. whenever I talk about the RFI summary analysis, I basically start with, yeah, it's a report about people who hate me. Like that's literally what, it's just like so many comments of hatred toward the Department of Energy for good reason. We failed to meet our end of the bargain. And let's be very clear, you could be kinder, but it is important to honestly start from where you actually are, not where you want to be. We are starting from a trust deficit in the Department of Energy, and I'm openly recognizing that, which is the only way that you can actually start to do it. EM realized they had a deficit, and that is why bridge builders like ECA exist, to try to start building some of that back when you start from such a place behind. So I do just want to kind of like bring not that they both work, but like tangible moments of both of those aspects into that acknowledgement. And I will end with this, which is moderately controversial, but Katie gave me the mic, so I'm going to take it, which is, it would be interesting if, just like we do land acknowledgements for tribal organizations, if we started as organizations to acknowledge that the conversation we're about to have is built on a precedent, these challenges. Like if I'm talking about nuclear waste, I need to probably mention Lyons, Kansas, where we just started dumping nuclear waste in Kansas without talking to the farmer. I need to start mentioning Hanford, right? I need to bring those into the conversation. It isn't the same as a land acknowledgement. I'm not making the exact connection, but it is in our brains, the potential that we need to start the conversation with that kind of acknowledgement. If we're talking about a nuclear power plant, let's talk about the things that have gone well, yes, but also challenges that we've actually faced in that site, because that may be a way for us to get a little bit of that trust back, because we're not ignoring the past. So I just want to add that as a potential action item for us, is a like nuclear acknowledgement. I don't think it will go well. In general, I think that will go pretty terribly, but I think it would be interesting. Okay.
You know what, Sam, though, there's an inherent message in there, and that is that yes, you can find loads of different stakeholder groups around Hanford who will say the government didn't do this and they should have done that. This should be legally addressed, or there needs to be flexibility to change. However, the communities around that site are today interested in new nuclear development and supply chain support. Yep. So I don't mean to be overly optimistic, but I am an optimist by nature. And it's important to recognize that it didn't kill the idea that they wanted to do more, but it does mean that perhaps the community is a bit more intelligent about how to come at these projects, and messages to share for other communities that are looking at it too.
I just want to pick up on one thing that Sam said about the history. I think that, that actually is so important for us to learn about and acknowledge as nuclear engineers, the history and the complicated legacy of our field. I think that when we talk about the progress of our field and our technology, we tend to sort of tell this linear story of technological triumph. And there's a lot of other things that happened along the way that we should also be learning about. And so for the nuclear engineers, especially the students on this call, and maybe also the faculty and researchers, if there are any, learn about the history of the field. We need to learn about our mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And there's lots of good stuff there too. Learn from the good stuff too. But I think that we really need to know our history as we chart a course towards the future.
As someone who's not an engineer, and obviously I can't shut up because I keep talking, but as someone who's not an engineer, I would just say that one thing I've learned to highlight for the engineering crowd is there is an absolute expectation of the time it takes to get regulatory approval, the time it takes for legal to go through things. There should be an assumption that it takes time to get support as well from everyone that's going to be impacted socially by one of these projects.
Thanks, everyone. No, the discussion so far is really good. I want to not really switch gears, but kind of dig into the consequence on all these different diverse communities and potentially a very broad framework for environmental justice. So and An NEI survey of its member utilities estimated a need for approximately an additional 90 gigawatts or 300 small modular reactors deployed to meet decarbonizing goals. And that's just for NEI member utilities. Basically, what we could expect is a lot of SMRs and MMRs in many different communities, some of which have never hosted a nuclear reactor before. Can decentralizing nuclear power distribute its risks in a more equitable way? Are there also potential challenges associated with broadly applying environmental justice best practices to numerous diverse communities? And, oh, sorry. And I wanted to direct that one to Kara.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, to echo maybe some of the things I've already said is, in a perfect world, you have communities that are looking for these projects and you're not going into a place that has no interest. So that would kind of help us avoid any of the kind of, how do you convince somebody? Hopefully they're already convinced that they're interested themselves and call people to them for that conversation. And then the second part of the question, which of course I've forgotten, was, can you read the second part of the question?
Are there also potential challenges associated with broadly applying environmental justice best practices to numerous diverse communities?
Yeah, I think I'd go back to what I said, which is no, there's no problem with having and outlining best practices. They can always feed a discussion, but you know, there needs to be recognition and incorporation of the fact that these communities will all be unique, and that needs to be considered as we address environmental justice.
I add one thing to what Kara just said. So the communities are all unique, but I think the aspiration on the part of a lot of the reactor designers is to have standardized technologies. And I can see why, right? Like it makes economic sense. It makes sense from trying to scale up these technologies. But I think, you know, even as these technologies are being designed and developed, I think that the developers would do well to engage with these communities and learn about what the potential impacts of these systems might be in the different places where they might be built. And I think it's important to anticipate those impacts, those concerns, the expectations that the different communities might have, because yes, maybe a standardized reactor is possible, but I think we'll also need to think about how, if not the technological system itself, but at least the facility, then how that might be adapted to different use contexts. I sort of see this tension between the specificity and the different needs that arise in different community contexts, and this sort of desire to standardize technology and have something that's one size fits all. So I think there's a tension there that we need to resolve.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to add to that?
I guess I'll just add one point. And that's, I think the second part of the question you asked, Katie, was, are the potential challenges in broadly applying best practices to lots of diverse communities? And I guess my response to that would be, well, I think a best practice, at least one that I share often when we're talking about environmental justice best practices, is tailoring what you're doing to the community. And that's true regardless of whatever type of project we're talking about or operations. Also, sorry, if you see a dog, she was barking, I have to make her be quiet. That's beside the point. I think my point is done. I will stop talking now.
Thanks. So I think now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about consent-based siting. So I'm going to direct this one to Sam and then have Kara follow up. So the DOE drafted a consent-based siting process for the storage and disposal of nuclear waste. Request for information, as Sam has mentioned, was issued in 2021, and 225 comments from the public were collected, dispositioned, and ultimately will be incorporated into the process. Could you talk a bit more about the consent-based siting program, both its strengths and areas for improvement? How do we ensure the terms are fair and flexible, and ensure that the federal government and private companies hold themselves accountable to this process and to the communities that host them?
Thank you so much. Everyone was laughing because they saw me smile so much when we talk about consent-based siting. It's like dream come true job that I get to lead this space. So with all that being said of how much of a dream this is, I really don't freaking care what it's called. And so I really think it's important for us to start with that when you ask for like ways that we can make this process sustainable, one of those ways is to stop trying to define a process too specifically based on your current needs. We are going to have a federal interim storage facility within the decade, if not 15 years, and we're going to have a repository shortly after that. And we're going to do that regardless of what we call the process, because while consent-based citing works right now and is a really important way for us to center the needs of the communities we are seeking to serve, if we call it contract-based citing next year, great. That's still a direction that when we sit down with a community, they're going to have certain conditions. We're going to have certain conditions. Those conditions have to be negotiated, and then success happens. But instead of just stating that we have conditions, good luck, community, and the rest may the odds be ever in your favor, is not a great way to run a process all the time. So, what do we know so far? We did have that summary analysis of the 225 comments. Although I started with how much they hated us, there was a lot of really good data in there as well. 1,600 pages, 16 to 1,700 pages, which if you're into environmental justice, I actually do recommend. It's a pretty good treasure trove of data of a lot of people bringing their honest thoughts. I'm a person who believes in the good intent. I'm an optimistic person, right? And so I believe these people were trying to help us make the process better, and we did. We learned from their process. Here's your crumb from a webinar that you can take as news, breaking news. We will have an updated consent-based citing process here within roughly a month and a half, roughly. Anything I am learning very quickly that the government process is a disaster. It is not a startup. And so I will not give you a specific date because I don't want to be held, but I do say that I am pushing it really hard. And within a few days, we're getting some comments back that could be our near final comments. So soon we will have an updated process that will walk a person from where we are today to the opening of a federal interim storage facility through a consent-based citing process. Now, that's going to look very, very unique to each community, but communities need guidance. So this is the way I like to think about it, right? We all drive, well, maybe we don't drive cars. I actually don't have my own car, but my husband does, right? So let's say we all have cars, right? We all still have to follow the speed limit. I am not always the best at this, but I do my best, right? So we have to follow those kinds of rules, no matter what type of technology or what type of space that we're using, right? These are guidance that we can all understand. And when we get on the road, we're consenting to other people being on the road. As much as many of us would love to be the only person and not have that traffic, right? That's not actually how a public system works. So I'll come back to the point of, we heard that people wanted resources, and that is why we put out, for the first time in history, $16 million to work on consent-based citing, which is an environmental justice victory unlike any other. And honestly, it's not getting as much wonder and love as it needs to get, but I also understand that it's nuclear waste, connected to nuclear waste, which makes it hard to engage with. And here's where, again, I will come back to, we are not just solving consent-based citing for nuclear waste. We are starting there, but we will learn practices here that could revolutionize how the government builds large infrastructure projects on a public need. This could revolutionize how we interact with the government and the energy communities that we are seeking to serve, right? All of them could benefit from this space. So take the money. There are 16 million, 6 to 8 awardees. Applications are due in December, mid-December, but we will love a letter of intent so we can again help making sure that you're getting the resources you need. If you have questions on it, we're happy to go forward. But in brief, because I work with Congress a lot. So here's the consent-based citing in a nutshell. We had a request for information. We got a lot of really great data and have an RFI summary that I think was just shared with your screen. We now have money going out the door to work on consent-based siting for a federal interim storage facility. We are not seeking volunteers. To be very clear, I will say it every time. Part of environmental justice is giving informed consent, and informed consent takes time. You do not just give a person a car, you make sure that they have driving education before they start driving the car. Before I ask anyone to get on the highway with me, I need to give them the best versions of driver's ed. And that is going to be at their own pace. As Aditi said, this is not me telling you an education system that you need to have. It's you actually helping educate the Department of Energy on the resources you need to be successful. And that is what we should all be doing in consent-based siting. It is not a win-lose game. It is a win-win-win. Local, national, and of course the actual community doing the work that we're trying to solve this national need with. So it's an all hands on deck moment, and I'm really excited for it. If you haven't guessed, I really am excited for consent-based siting. It's working. We're getting I'll end here, and then I'd love my colleagues to tell me what they're hearing on this topic. That's always great. Because I'm in an echo chamber, but we're hearing really good things. We have tons of people responding, as is evident by the last minute me joining this panel. I am just on a whirlwind tour right now, trying to keep everybody engaged with this. And there's a lot of excitement. So join the excitement, learn more about consent-based siting. You can learn more about that on our website at the Department of Energy. And we look forward to hearing from you. Okay, there we go.
Can I ask Sam a question? Sam, I'm really curious to all of those responses that came in to the consent-based siting RFI. What was something that was really surprising or that stood out to you?
State engagement. States engaged more this time than ever before because they learned. Last time we didn't do so great at state engagement, let's just call it that. And so I would say that the biggest lesson that I learned was that states, their environmental agencies, their governors, their state legislatures, their leadership said, we want to be involved from day one. Right at the beginning, we want to know how this process is laying out, and we need to be engaged with, which was very different from before. In 2017, I believe, if I can remember correctly, was the last time we asked for comments. We only got 30 versus the 220, right? And barely any states engaged, right? There was almost none. So it's not a specific lesson learned, I would call it. I know you're probably looking for what's a tidbit of thing, because I would say that there was there was a lot of ideas, and those are all in the report. But the thing that really stuck out to me, and we changed the funding opportunity announcement to specifically mention states because we saw the state engagement. So it was they spoke, we did something with that and said, yes, if you're a local community, we totally want you to apply. We're not telling you that you have to have a state engaged, but you should start thinking about state level engagement now rather than once you already have a lot of conversations with the Department of Energy. I hope that answers your question, Aditi. It was state engagement. Yep.
Yeah, just to run on that, first and foremost, bravo, Sam. ECA has been one of those groups for years and years saying, get resources out to interested communities who want to work on this and know more. Yep. And it took a long time, but there we go. Thank you, Sam. I also want to give credit to Sam for being something else that ECA has asked for years, which is a champion. This is an important mission. It's not sexy, unfortunately. It's not what you're going to hear about during the debates for state office or national office, but it's a real important mission, a national security mission, and it needs to be talked about, looked at that way, and communities and states that step up need to be viewed as serving a national mission, and there needs to be consideration of what do they get in exchange for that? And it sounds a little tacky, and it's not. If you're thinking about a community who says, for example, all right, let's figure out consent-based siting for an interim storage facility. You know what? We want to be a hub. We want to look at this new nuclear technology and we want to say, great, so this is going to burn spent fuel one day. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and talk about a visioning exercise where we're bringing in spent nuclear fuel. It stays here. And we got a research reactor for a university nearby. And we also have a new advanced reactor that they're trying to demo that's also going to burn this fuel. So we need to look at these things holistically. And I think that the conversation that Sam is providing resources to start, the idea that Sam is saying as excitedly as they are, that this is going to happen in 10 years and this is going to happen in 15 years, it itself provides some level of confidence, because if anything we've learned since the 70s, where we were first trying to have this conversation, fits and starts don't do anything to solve this problem. If in fact, fits and starts compound the problem, because nobody trusts that there's actually going to be a commitment to moving forward. Giving out the resources, having a report, what we heard, having the funding opportunity come out right after that, it's momentum and it shows a commitment. And I think all of those things will get people who kind of half listened back into the arena for the conversation. So big kudos, Sam, for getting that stuff done. We were thrilled, and see our applications for more.
Thanks, everyone. So for this next question, I'd like to direct it to Hillary. It's about the kind of screening tools that have been developed to basically pair companies with communities that might want to host their activities. So basically, these tools can collect data on, say, public opinion, demographics, proximity to population centers, geography, and so on. How can these tools help mitigate the risk of targeting and coercing disadvantaged communities that don't want to host nuclear activities, but also help highlight disadvantaged communities that may want to benefit from the economic stability and opportunities that nuclear activities can offer? And how do we encourage both communities and organizations to use these tools?
So I actually just realized that when I initially read your question and put together my thoughts on it, I was thinking of broader based tools like EP's EJ Screen and CEQ's Community and Economic Justice Screening Tool and DOE's Energy Justice Dashboard. Which apply across the board. I'm now realizing that your question is much more specific than that and talks about potential advanced nuclear reactor waste facility sites. And I'm admittedly not familiar with these tools, and they sound very cool. So I would love to turn it over to someone to speak about those, but I can speak briefly about the tools I am very familiar with. And those are the ones I mentioned. There's been a proliferation of mapping-based tools on the federal level off a lot of states too, that are these GIS-based mapping tools that combine geographic data with other data sets about communities. And some of them have been around for years, like EJ Screen. It recently was revamped, had some new data put into it. Others are new entirely, like DOE's Energy Justice Dashboard, CEQ's tool, and they have different focal points. But when it comes to, identifying communities, if we're talking about siting, and we're talking about citing new projects, and which is, I think, the context in which we frame this question, I think the tools like this are super beneficial as a first step in identifying all potential stakeholders who might be impacted by a project and therefore should be included in engagement and outreach efforts. And this includes environmental justice communities. But I think the targeted engagement that follows after that initial identification just can't be replaced by simply using a tool. And I say that I'm talking about the general tools. There may be some specific tool that I don't know about that has some feature, and I'll look forward to hearing about that. But the targeted engagement that I think stems from that initial broad identification that the tools I'm talking about can yield is really helpful, and will give the information on concerns and aversions or willingness to host a site. But the tools alone won't do it for you. And I will pause because I may have missed like a huge part of this by talking about the tools I'm mentioning.
No, that's perfect. I wanted you to touch on those broader tools, but also Aditi, you can fill in about specifically maybe the University of Michigan tools that you've shared.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit about this. So at the University of Michigan, specifically at the Fastest Path to Zero initiative, we've been developing some of these tools. And the initial set of tools that we developed actually were with the DOE and the developers in mind. So there's a tool, these are GIS-based mapping tools. So there's a tool that helps you sort of compare different sites across the country as potential sites for advanced reactor facilities, for example. And there are many different screening layers, including EJ-specific screening layers. There's another tool that you can use to look at different sort of public perceptions of nuclear across the country. So how do people feel about nuclear energy sort of broadly? Are they supportive or are they not? How would they feel about a nuclear facility being built in their community? And there's actually, it's interesting to see how those things vary. You know, there's sort of a general support for nuclear. It's often up to like even 70 to 80%. But then when it comes to actually having a facility in their community, it drops to like 40%. So that's an interesting trend we've been seeing. But then we realized that a lot of these tools that we were developing, as I just said, were really with developers and the DOE in mind. And we wanted to develop tools that would be useful for communities. And so in the next phase of our work, the tools that we're going to be developing are really going to be community focused. So there's one in particular that's going to be funded by the National Reactor Innovation Center, and we're just sort of calling it the community tool at the moment. I'm sure it'll have a nicer name eventually. And the purpose of that tool really is going to be to create a platform to inform communities about these advanced reactor technologies, to open a channel of communication between the communities and the developers, so the communities can ask questions of the developers, and also to facilitate conversations across and between the communities themselves. So they're not, you know, and I think this actually gets to something that you said, Katie, about like, how can we prevent these tools from being sort of coercive almost, and like, how can these tools further sort of our goals of equity and EJ as we think about developing these advanced nuclear technologies and citing them. And so we think that that specific component of giving communities who are across the country who might be thinking about this, giving them this opportunity to dialogue with each other, we think is especially important. So that the initial version of that community tool that I just mentioned will probably be ready sometime next fall. And at that point, you know, we'll be happy to share it with all of you. Actually, all of our tools are open source. I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and maybe the organizers can share it with everybody. You can access the existing tools. They're all open source. So yes, I'll stop talking now.
No, thank you so much. And we have one more listed question, which has largely been kind of covered with previous answers, but I'll just give Kara and Sam one last chance to fill in any gaps here. But it's essentially about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And, you know, generally lots of funding has gone towards the DOE to, you know, advance programs, which some include advanced reactor siting. And we want to ensure that communities, you know, have access to that funding. So how do we let them know that it exists? And not specific to the infrastructure bill, but just in general, how do communities get information from the DOE, and, you know, how are they able to make those informed decisions? And conversely, how are their responses disseminated back to the federal government?
Kara, I'll have you go first because it's
Okay.
probably great. So
I don't know who wants to go first, Sam. I just quickly want to circle back to Aditi's last discussion, and that is, you know, one thing from again, to break down engineer into English, no offense, is that, you know, I think when you're talking to communities about advanced nuclear, it's helpful not to talk about why the technology is different, why is it better, how did it change over time, but what can it do? You know, can you create industrial heat? Can you create hydrogen in the future? So just in terms of how engineers who are developing speak to people who maybe don't have that kind of background, it's really helpful, I think, for communities to understand it from that perspective. So just wanted to hit that. The IRA and funding. First and foremost, it's going to sound like I just love everybody at DOE all the time. And I can assure you, and please check our comments, that is not always true. However, DOE has done a great job of saying this money is out there. It's almost kind of like drinking from a fire hose, actually. There's so many different announcements of different opportunities that are available to get some funding. It actually is a job in and of itself at the local level to go through and see who should be applying for that. I mean, almost to the point where local communities are saying, my gosh, do we need to hire another FTE just to know? So big props for getting that information out, and another kind of thank you to DOE, but we just had a call with the loan program office to talk about how are communities receiving this information and how can they respond? How do they make sure that the money is going where the money needs to be going? So just the trust that's built from saying, hey, we got this, we're not quite sure how to do it in the most efficient way. What are you hearing down on the ground is in and of itself, bravo, thank you very much. We'll yell at you after we don't get the money that we want later. And as far as the IRA thing, you know, just from an environmental justice perspective, from a community like the ones that I have the benefit of working with, every administration comes in and has some sort of big push, right? So whether it's environmental justice, place-based initiatives, there are ways, I think, that you can look at communities that are helping to serve a national security mission and energy independence mission by saying, hey, you guys have been part of the Manhattan Project, you're a cleanup site for the Department of Energy. You know what, why don't we look at things that under the IRA could benefit both of us, the federal government, the state, the community. A perfect example, low-hanging fruit would be put in some EV charging infrastructure around Department of Energy sites. You'll get some of those community folks driving electric cars. You'll have them look at the department and say, hey, this is great. We're kind of, you know, we're rural and nobody was going to come and build that stuff here otherwise. If there would be some way to kind of set communities that are helping to serve, again, the national mission, give them some sort of preference or priority in what these larger initiatives are that come and go as administrations change, I think that would go a long way for telling a community, we're going to support you. We're not just going to build and leave. We're here for the long run. Now I'll shut up.
Never shut up, you're too brilliant. Okay, so in like 1 minute, here we go. So first off, we need to be better. Although I'm really glad that you're saying that we're doing well, we need to be better because it is still hard. I am a proud kid of Kansas, and the small town mayor in Kansas may not have any idea how to access some of these funds and doesn't have the budget to hire an FTE to figure it out. And so we are doing in the consent-based siting process, we changed it up. And instead of it being a direct necessary application, we did consortia. So a group can come together, pool their resources to get funding, and we can then give those funds out directly to communities or through these consortia as those who kind of know what the ins and outs of government funding are. So the government needs to be providing more of those type of consortia level spaces so that NGOs, universities, and communities themselves can all collaborate to get the best access to funds. So that's one area. We're doing good, but we could always be doing better. And second, last but not least, we really need to be making sure that we're making these applications actually accessible. One of my proud moments is that I removed the requirement of a fax number in our application, because I looked at them and I said, okay, you clearly never had a millennial here in your leadership, but no, we're not going to require some poor person to find a fax number for you in order to be able to apply to this application. Why? Because environmental justice is about accessibility. It's about procedural and distributive justice. And one of the ways you do that is making it easier to access, not harder. Give us the challenge of too many applications. Don't give the challenge to the communities that they can't actually access in the first place. It didn't perfectly answer your question, Katie, but it was the best that I could give you for a budget. So there you go.
Oh, that's great. And I know we're over the hour, but we've had two audience questions from Malachi Nelson, and I just want to ask you guys just one of them if you still have the time and can stay. The question is, often with larger projects, there are benefits and costs such as economic benefits and environmental or land use costs. It's important to talk to the stakeholders that the project will impact, but Aditi made a good point, and this was earlier on, I think maybe our second question, about how cultures change and time passes. How do you recommend introducing future generations into the stakeholder discussions that occur? So does anyone want to take that on? Maybe Aditi, since you made the point to begin with.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this from a research perspective, and there's some really interesting ways to do this. There's a technique called futuring and backcasting, where you sort of get the community together and you go through this process of envisioning what you want or what the community hopes the future will be, and then sort of working back from that envisioned future or multiple futures to the present. But even that doesn't quite get at this question of, especially for the very long-lived infrastructures like a nuclear waste repository, we don't know what the future generations are going to want. And so there, I think it's actually on us as the designers and the developers of those facilities to introduce some element of adaptability, so that, and for the nuclear waste repository, I think a very critical sort of dimension of that is reversibility. Like, what if the future generations want to take out the nuclear waste? What if they don't want it there? And so those are the types of things that I think we should think about. Like, what are the ways in which we can make these infrastructures more adaptable and reversible, and that reversibility might take different forms for different kinds of infrastructure. So I think that's my two-part answer at the moment. Ask me again and it might change in a year, but I think it involves sort of going through the systematic visioning exercise with the communities, and Clara's talked a little bit about this as well. But then also it's on us as engineers to make our technologies more flexible and adaptable to the changing times.
Well said, Aditi. 2 quick points on it. First is that we need to learn from those who are already thinking this way. Indigenous communities and similar groups to Indigenous communities think they've told me in meetings, like, I'm thinking 7 generations down the line, right? Like that, I'm not, you're the one who's thinking about tomorrow. I'm thinking 7 generations down. And let's be very clear, that is how you actually start to integrate these decisions in, because if a community trusts its elders to keep imparting this information and why we made this decision this way and how it can benefit us, that is better than trying to just propaganda young people and tell them that it will all be okay, right? Like that is the first part. So learn from those who are doing it, including Indigenous communities. The second part, give young people, just as Aditi talked about the reversibility, give them actual power. Your late breaking news, we're going to have a council here in my office for youth to be able to bring in their perspectives rather than just have an RFI summary where they're not going to respond to because it's an RFI government summary, and that's not how they're going to access points. But if we can give them actual decision-making power, we will be in a better position for them to feel like the reversibility can be put off for like more time, right? Like if you feel comfortable with it, then you're going to be sharing that information. And one way, I'll end with this arrogantly, is me as a part, right? Like we finally have a young person able to actually make decisions on this policy. And I've been trying, I just got back from Belgium where we had a whole conversation on intergenerational equity. And one of their major parts was they realized like on this panel, everyone was the age of my parents, right? Like, and that is saying something, that if we don't let actual decision-making happen among young individuals, it's not environmental justice, because we're not actually incorporating their perspective. We're simply giving them, like a check mark. We talk to the kids, like that's not enough anymore. So no more gold stars for letting us sit on panels. Gold stars go to actual actionable policy making level decisions that you can actually be a part of. That's how I would say that first.
Okay, that was a really good way to wrap this up. Thank you all, and I should have budgeted an hour and a half for this discussion, I think, but maybe next time. But I want to thank everyone on our panel. This has been wonderful. You all hopped on this pretty last minute too, so I really appreciate your flexibility. I want to thank NEI for hosting this event, and of course I want to thank US WIN and US WIN ComCom for all their support. And finally, I want to thank the audience for signing on. You've all been wonderful. All right, take care.